Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We are joined by Rabbi Chaim Eisen, the host of Jewish Philosophy Matters on YouTube. Check out that channel; it's unbelievable. I was turned on to this channel by Rabbi Joshua Maruf, my rabbi, years ago. When I asked him, I said, who are some rabbis you recommend to bring on?" And he said, "Oh, Rabbi Chaim Eisen." It was one of the first names that came up. So thank you for joining us, really.
Thank you.
And I just want to get into it because we recently, Dovidchai and myself, we were listening to the Free Will series, and we wanted to do a podcast about this. So I'll just start off with the first question. Science has broadly, in the modern era, made famous particularly by Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky, reached a consensus that we are determined to act the way we do. This has been shown in a few real-life scenarios and experiments, such as experiment performed by checking the association between the verdict of hungry versus satiated judges, where the hungry judge would more often incarcerate than a judge who just had lunch. Additionally, the case of Phineas Gage, who was seemingly robbed of choice after surviving a large iron rod driven through his head. However, in part 4 of your free will series in JPM, you state unequivocally that free will is a miracle. This seems to agree with the scientific consensus of determinism. Given this observation, would you say that faith is required for free will and that science would be unable to prove free will materially? To paraphrase Sapolsky, the burden of proof is on those who advocate free will because they would have to prove that, et ceteris paribus, the person observed would have been able to act differently.
Okay, obviously there are a lot of components of this question. And I think the first verity that I should affirm here is by no means would anyone claim that free will is ubiquitous. Certainly, we don't regard it as something that characterizes any non-human animals. And the very realization that this is something that we would claim as a unique endowment of human beings necessarily invites the question, upon what basis do we claim that human beings are in some fundamental ontological sense different from any other living things? Is that something that lends itself to rigorous proof? Candidly, I think not. And it could be very well that the invocation of miracle here may be germane, except I think we need to define our terms more carefully here. That is, while, again, we would certainly agree that not only is free will something unique to human beings, but something that isn't always to be found in human beings either, in what vein would we be able to discern circumstances that, from our perspective, would dictate the invocation of free will by way of explanation? I'd like to begin by invoking a very time-worn, even cliched analogy to the guy who loses his keys on the way home on a dark night and returns to the lone pool of light beneath the only street lamp on the street to look for his keys there. And of course, inevitably the question, is he wise or is he stupid? And inevitably the answer, my favorite 2-word answer, it depends. If he's returned to that lone street light to look for his keys beneath it because that's the only place the keys could possibly be, since it's the only place that's illuminated, obviously he's stupid. On the other hand, if he returns there because I don't know where I lost my keys, I may have lost them where the street is completely dark and then I won't find them, but maybe I dropped them under the street lamp, then that could be a very wise course. Of course, with the caveat that, number one, I don't know if I'm going to find my keys there. Number two, I might find a set of keys and it might not be mine. Someone else might have dropped his keys at the same time. The reason I'm invoking this here is because what I think we would all agree is for him to presume that because only beneath the street lamp is the street illuminated, therefore the rest of the street doesn't exist, is, to be extremely charitable, a leap of faith. It is no more of a leap of faith to presume that the rest of the street doesn't exist than to presume that the keys have to be wherever I choose to look for them. And of course, the analog to this analogy is, well, when we speak of who has the burden of proof, I would be more inclined to raise the question of, altogether, to what extent are matters of substance in life susceptible to rigorous proofs, one way or the other. And with respect to the development of Western science, which has unequivocally provided us with innumerable assets in our being able to conduct the affairs of life, a major question is the extent to which science can be seen as establishing a definitive ontology, as opposed to what works. And this, of course, is a much, much longer discussion than one that pertains to free will. But what I'll state for our purposes at present is that trying to extrapolate from the success of some set of experiments to any definitive ontological statement is unequivocally no less of a leap of faith than any other. We have to recognize the limitations of our knowledge. We get into a lot of trouble altogether because of our almost inescapable pretensions of omniscience. Now, I don't state that as something to be condemned, because on some plane, a very inclination to try to extrapolate from some limited set of data to an all-encompassing worldview is the hallmark of the human outlook on the world. We strive to interpret reality rather than merely assimilate data as data gatherers. And far be it from me to indict what is, of course, the essence of the philosophical quest with which I wholly identify. But it's important for us to recognize that it is a quest. It's not a certainty. Interpretation, by definition, is not what I observe, but what I impose upon my observations. So, proofs, we don't have any proofs of free will. There isn't any proof of the absence of free will. Again, I'm going to reiterate. Can we prove that human beings are ontologically distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom? I think not. Do I believe that human beings are distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom? I think yes, but not because I can prove it. If you ask me on what grounds do I assert it altogether, so, you mentioned in a different context in our discussion, Descartes. Cogito ergo sum. How do we relate to that statement? Is it some kind of a syllogism that proves existence? I think, therefore I am. Descartes definitely didn't intend it as a syllogism. Personally, my inclination, although I admit this may not square with Descartes' own understanding, is it is a subjective conviction. I have a subjective experience of engaging in thought that convinces me that I, as a thinker, exist. Sentience imposes upon me an inescapable sense of selfhood. When I say imposes upon me, I'm really speaking exclusively in subjective terms. I've got it. If someone were to come to me and say, well, I'm not convinced by that argument, I don't know if I exist, my response, of course, would be, if you're not convinced you exist, why should I be convinced that you exist? You may just be a figment of my imagination. But I have this subjective conviction. And likewise, in the same vein, I have a subjective conviction that I am distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom, that I am endowed with something that, of course, neuroscientists describe as the hard problem. Consciousness. I am endowed with it. What is it? I couldn't tell you. I certainly don't subscribe to attempts, however well-meaning, of people like, for example, Penrose, to try to understand consciousness as something that would somehow derive from the quantum effects taking place in microtubules in neurons. I don't think there's going to be a physical explanation that'll be found. So in this vein, while using the word miracle may seem awfully hackneyed, a platitude of cliches, I'm going to use it in the more rigorous sense of something that I don't believe I will be able to rigorously demonstrate on any definitive plane, but it doesn't make me any less convinced that it exists. Ultimately, if I ask myself, upon what basis altogether do I posit the existence of spirituality, I would have a hard time providing any kind of rigorous answer, even though it's definitely a conviction. And honestly, I think that's true of anyone who posits that spirituality is real. I've told generations of Talmidim that if anyone, in response to the question, why do you believe in God, says anything other than because I believe I experienced him, then you know he's a fraud, or he doesn't understand the question. Experience is something that is irreducible and irreducibly subjective, but that doesn't mean it's in any way less real. I must concede, on a personal plane, I feel more than to anyone else beholden in my Weltanschauung to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Sefer Kuzari. I certainly feel very much beholden to the other luminaries among the Rishonim as well. But in this regard, what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi teaches me more than anything else is the centrality of the subjective experience. And that subjective experience, again, is the basis for my conviction that consciousness is real. It is a basis for the unprovable contention that life is intrinsically meaningful. You know, I always like to gravitate to that question of meaning in life as a good way of characterizing the distinction between theism and atheism without invoking the name of God. I prefer to avoid invoking the name of God because, let's face it, we don't really understand what we mean when we talk about God anyway, do we? But we have some kind of intuitive sense of what we mean when we speak of meaning in life. Well, from the perspective of the atheist, he can undoubtedly dedicate his life to any number of lofty causes. But in as much as his very existence is a consequence of pure chance, there obviously cannot be any intrinsic meaning. And again, of course, in much the same vein as everything we've discussed until now, can we prove that life is intrinsically meaningful? I don't believe we can. Am I convinced that my life is meaningful? Yes, I am. Could that be a delusion? It could be a delusion. Everyone ultimately is going to have to decide for himself if he regards that conviction, which I believe is a veritably universal one, at least that's my impression so far, if that conviction that life is meaningful is a consequence of delusion or a reflection of reality. That's not something that can be proven one way or the other, but does that place the burden of proof on one camp or the other? I don't see how it could possibly construe it to be that way. So I'm going to say the same thing here. That is, to be more specific, returning to the specific context of the question, we definitely recognize, and this is, of course, not merely some kind of Judaic abstraction, this is halacha. We recognize there are circumstances in which an individual does not have free will. I'm not merely talking about singular individuals, if you will, like Paro, according to the Midrash, as punishment for what he had done beforehand, that he was denied free will either in all the plagues or in the last 5 plagues. I'm speaking more universally about a phenomenon that is unequivocally recognized in halakha of a shoteh. Now, exactly where we will pin down the halachic quantity, shoteh, on a procedural plane is an excellent question. We're not going to discuss that right now. But someone who is deemed a shoteh in a state of derangement, indeed, is adjudged to not have free will. And that doesn't only mean that he isn't held responsible for any crimes he may commit. You know, in the lead up to Pesach, someone who is itim chalim itim shoteh has bouts of derangement, of insanity. And Leil HaSeder, he is in a state of derangement, and he eats matzah. And before the night is out, he returns to a state of sanity. So what do we tell him? I mean, assuming it's not going to cause any endangerment for him, because obviously it's pikuach nefesh here, but go eat matzah again. He ate matzah already. He ate matzah when he wasn't obligated to do mitzvot. He ate matzah when he was acting under compulsion and not as one with free will. And as a result, not only is he not held accountable for crimes that he may have committed, he also doesn't get any credit for mitzvot that he may have committed. So he tells him to eat matzah now. In other words, we recognize that the circumstances of free will may indeed be, for certain individuals, non-existent. For others, occasional. For all of us, perhaps also fleeting. But that doesn't in any way negate the verity that a human being can be a responsible being. And that ultimately, I'm going to say, is the foundation of the whole discussion of free will. It's significant to note, when we just consider what the ranking of free will is in the whole discussion of foundational beliefs. It is, of course, very obviously, glaringly lacking from Rambam's list of 13 foundational creeds, which is something, I discussed this in the podcasts, something that Rav Yosef Albo in Sefer Yikarim notes as an ostensible astonishment. Something as basic as free will isn't on Rambam's list. And ultimately, his answer, which I think is very compelling, is the reason it's not on the list is because it's too foundational. Because Rambam is giving you a list of foundational beliefs for dat elokit, for a divine system of belief and conduct. And free will is foundation even for dat nimusit, even for a consensual system that isn't predicated upon any belief in revelation. So something that is this fundamental in human affairs, indeed, is not provable, but that shouldn't really surprise us, because ultimately, how much of life is truly susceptible to proofs? In this regard, I always feel particularly drawn to a quotation. It's a quotation of Einstein. He made this statement in a lecture delivered before the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin on the 27th of January, 1921. As far as the propositions of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality. If I can share with you on an utterly pedestrian plane what I think Einstein is saying here. If I ask you, is 1 + 1 = 2 an absolutely true statement? I think we could agree, certainly in the conventional meanings of the words 1 plus equals and 2, that is definitionally true. Okay, but now if I ask you, well, I gave you one apple, and I'm giving you a second apple. Do you have absolutely 2 apples now? Is that absolutely true? I think this is another opportunity to invoke my favorite 2-word answer. It depends. It depends on what you mean by apples. If by apples, you just mean placeholders, then 1 apple and another apple equals, well, it's just the same as 1x plus 1x equals 2x. You just cancel the x's and you have 1 + 1 = 2. But what if you really mean apples? If you really mean apples, then in the parlance of formal logic, we'll say there are a whole host of auxiliary hypotheses that need to be dragged into the discussion. Did I really give you an apple in the first place? What happened to the apple? Did someone eat it on the way? Did I give you a second apple, or maybe it was just holding up a mirror to the first one? Did someone make applesauce? Were you dreaming this entire affair and it never actually happened in external reality? All those are germane when we ask about one apple and another apple. In other words, in the messy affairs of actual physical reality, we don't have proofs. It's only as far as the laws of mathematics are certain that they don't refer to reality. But the moment that we're actually referring to reality, they are not certain. So, do we have proofs? No. Does anyone else? I think not.
Well said. You had a question on this, or?
No, I was just enjoying and writing down some
Okay.
notes.
So we'll go to the next question.
So additionally to not proving free will, you say that it is not that we always have free will. In fact, much of the time we act on determinism. Rather, you say we are given brief windows of time where we can act on free will. This seems intuitively true. In fact, you say that each of us has a sort of moving front line of free will, and the way we act in those moments dictates our determined course of action in the future. Based on this, how can we ourselves know when we act on free will? Is it a Cartesian free will where I think, therefore I have free will, or is it something else?
Yeah, so first, to give credit where credit is due, this essential thesis is one that, as far as I'm aware, was first articulated by Rabbi Dessler. It appears in Contras HaBechira Aleph in Michtav Me'Eliyahu, and I personally heard it also from two of my mentors who were both students of Rav Dessler. But I'll note, with respect to the essential thesis, certainly as I'm integrating it into my understanding of free will, is it limits the discussion of free will exclusively to those arenas in which it is a question of moral choice. And to that extent, do we have the wherewithal to know that we are choosing freely if we are aware of our facing a dilemma of moral choice? Then we have the wherewithal to indeed be able to enunciate a clear understanding of two alternatives. We're essentially, and here, if anything, I'm going to be basing myself most directly upon Rambam in the second chapter of the guide, in considering what the nature of the sin of Adam and Chava was, the realization that the a priori basis of all choice lies in the distinction between truth and falsity, where, on the one hand, one might well argue that truth versus falsity is no choice. Truth is real, falsity is not. You can't actually choose what doesn't exist. But in our post-free world, being endowed with, to employ Rambam's terminology, imagination, which of course Rambam tells us in the second unit of the guide in chapter 12 is identical with the Yetzer Hara, we have the wherewithal to be creative. That creativity is, on the one hand, what drives Adam and Chava out of Gan Eden, because Gan Eden is not a creative realm. Closed parentheses on that. What's germane for our purposes is that in as much as that encumbrance, that endowment that we receive as a result of eating of the tree of knowing good and evil is imagination, creativity, we have the wherewithal to create an alternative reality. So while in the anti-tree world, it was truth versus falsity, in the post-tree world, it becomes good versus evil, and good and evil are both realities. The asymmetry of truth versus falsity is sundered. Good and evil strike us as two alternative realities. There is a pseudo-symmetry. And the challenge for us is, on the one hand, we have the wherewithal to be able to see either of these as true if we so choose. But on the other hand, one of those supposed truths, deep down, we know is a lie. Because it's, after all, something that we've concocted out of falsity. So where I am able to see clearly two alternatives that will both be able to present themselves to me as truths, and simultaneously, I have the wherewithal to be able to distinguish between them and say, this one is true, this one is a lie. That's precisely where I am choosing as a free agent endowed with moral choice. And again, that's something that only applies to a relatively limited number of experiences that any of us have over the course of our days, arguably even of course over the course of our lives, because in so many domains of life, either I have no allure to embrace falsity because it's patently clear to me that the alternative to what I perceive to be the truth is completely untenable, or the truth is something that is so rarefied and lofty that I have no sense of being drawn to such a level of truth, and I'm living on my own routine. In either of those instances, though, I'm not choosing freely. I'm choosing freely where I'm able to see both of those alternatives. And of course, the critical word that needs to be invoked in speaking of free moral choice is responsibility. Because where I have moral choice, I have responsibility. Now, those who negate the existence of free will obviously deny human responsibility altogether. That's self-evident. And indeed, I think that's part of the agenda. Can we prove that we as human beings are responsible? Again, I'm going to posit that we cannot. But I will not only argue that we believe that human beings are responsible, but that we can even sense our being responsible where we are, when we are under the circumstances in which we are choosing. And to the extent that we make those choices as responsible human beings, from our perspective, that's the greatest gift that God gives us, to be responsible human beings. We are aware that that is indeed what is taking place. We have chosen, and we bear responsibility, first and foremost, for the effect that the choice will have on us. And second of all, of course, the effect that it'll have on the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. So that's actually a very fascinating point of view, because I think that sort of implicit in the Jewish Weltanschauung is that there is an idea of objective truths of some sort because, of belief in Hashem. But it sounds like from the thesis you're putting forth that actually objective truths in a post-tree world is not really accurate. It's more as though God imbues us with some sort of sense of what is true and what is false in our moral choices. But you can't really say that there's objective truth in a post-tree world.
Well, what I would prefer to say is we do believe subjectively that there exists an objective truth out there. Just we can't know that objective truth as long as we are bounded by our own subjectivity in here, which is ultimately, of course, why lo yir ani ha'adam b'chai, why mankind cannot see God while alive in this world, because we enunciate as a foundation of our belief what we read in Yirmiyahu chapter 10, verse 10, Hashem Elokim Emet. God is absolute truth, as Rambam notes in citing these words in the first chapter of the Laws of Fundamentals of Torah. That is, God is unconditional, absolute truth. Everything else is conditional, contingent truth. But we aren't able to connect with truth on that level, which is why, as long as we are alive in this world, mankind cannot see. We all understand from Rambam, third chapter of the Guide, that seeing in this context means understanding. We cannot understand God. That's a verity that circumscribes us in this world. But there's one critical caveat that we always need to bring into this discussion. And this is a principle that is enunciated by the Talmud, the Gemara in Tractate Sotah, page 9. The context is one that we should at the very least note. The expression in three pithy words, Nikarim divrei emet. Words of truth are recognizable. Now, the context is downright unseemly. The context is, so how did Delilah know that Shimshon had indeed revealed the truth after he had deceived her so many times? And that's the answer. Words of truth are recognizable. Now, Delilah is not exactly in the pantheon of people who lived their lives in such ethereal consonance with truth, was she? But that's exactly the point. Even she could recognize truth if she wanted to. All the more so all the rest of us. In other words, the principle of Nikarim Divrei Emet means, if I may express it in terms of a faith orientation, no, God did not dump us in on the deep end of the pool and say, sink or swim, because then we would have sunk. God endowed us with the wherewithal to be able to perceive truth if we so desired, which of course simultaneously means that we won't if we don't so desire, because that's part of responsibility. But we have the wherewithal to resonate with truth. And I must note, it is in this expansive view of the implications of Nikarim Divrei Emet that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi invokes this line in the fourth treatise of Sefer Kuzari in section 17. And that's precisely the resonance that he's affirming, that we have the wherewithal to connect with truth when we so want.
Fantastic. So in an article published to the OU titled, "Is Yeshiva Education Accomplishing What It Should?" you write, even advanced students are often appallingly ignorant of the axioms of Jewish belief and are at a total loss to grapple with the theological, philosophical, and spiritual challenges of contemporary society. What are the most important topics with which you believe it is vital for yeshiva students to be familiar with?
If I remember correctly, I think I wrote that article like 20 years ago or so. It's only gotten worse since then.
For sure.
Unfortunately.
Yes.
The way I would express what to me is the most crucial lacuna. And on some plane, everything we've discussed today is a subset of this problem, is the ability to engage in rigorous critical thinking. And I'm going to place my primary emphasis here upon the word rigorous. That is, if we cannot define our terms in a compelling manner that enables us to understand just what it is that we're discussing, then for all intents and purposes, we're not discussing anything. And all too often, matters that indeed pertain to the foundations of our belief system, the foundations of what believing in Torah means. When we talk about God, what are we talking about? Are left to the kind of hand-waving sloppiness that is an insult to the subjects at hand, and of greater concern to me, a put-off to those sincere, often gifted, but not necessarily, but sincere students who are craving such a rigorous level of understanding. And the greatest tragedy, those who crave rigorous thinking will find it. But if they're not going to find it in the Beit Midrash, in Torah study, they'll find it someplace else. Whether they will remain formally affiliated with Jewish beliefs and practices or not, their minds, their hearts are someplace else. And those are precisely the students who should be the spiritual leaders of the next generation. And this discussion is one that, to put it in very clear terms, is veritably impossible to conduct without the invocation of the classics of Jewish thought. In particular, of course, that's Rishonei Sfarad, medieval Spain, where for a number of historical reasons, that was very much the parlance of the time of the society. It had a lot to do with the accessibility of Arabic translations of the classics of Greek philosophy that had been translated between the 8th and 10th centuries and posed a challenge to theistic systems that existed in the Arabic-speaking world, that is, both Judaism and Islam, and there was a need to enunciate a coherent, cogent response. But in any case, the reality is that there isn't any period with which we bear that one, because it was a poor society in which the intellectual foment that was taking place outside was taking place inside. And the challenge was principally coming from a system that purported to explain everything through rationalism. Of course, then it was neo-Aristotelianism. Today it's science, but still a system that purports to do away with any need for revelation, any need for a theistic system. And the Rishonim, these luminaries of medieval Spain, established for us a set, a corpus that we ignore at our peril. And unfortunately, ignore it we do.
So what would you say would be like a way of kind of fixing the system, right? The yeshiva system. What is it? What would you change about the current setup, let's just say?
Well, I believe it was roughly a quarter century ago that Professor Alan Bloom published his famous transformative, The Closing of the American Mind. And in summation, his essential thesis was, it is ignorance of the classics that provide the grist for an intellectual discourse that results in that closing of the American mind. I feel pained to declare that we should write a sequel, The Closing of the Jewish Mind. And it's the same reason, because of ignorance of the classics upon which any meaningful intellectual discourse pertaining to Judaism need to be predicated. That is, study of these classics of the Rishonim. Obviously, there's a challenge here, and I'm not in any way minimizing the challenge. The challenge is one of translation, and I don't mean linguistic translation. I mean translating concepts. Obviously, the response to the challenges of neo-Aristotelianism is not going to cut it as the exact same response transposed onto the challenges that we face today. But that enterprise of translation is eminently doable. I can testify to that personally because I've spent my life doing it. And it's only by so doing that we have the wherewithal to engage in a meaningful intellectual discourse, and we're not. Now, I need to impose one additional caveat here, just so what I'm stating here won't be misunderstood. I've certainly had the experience of eminent rebbeim in yeshiva rebutting what I just said. So, what do you mean? I don't give them intellectual rigor. I told them about machlokas, tosim, and sivos. That's not intellectual rigor. And far be it from me, chas v'chalila, to minimize the intellectual rigor that is necessary in order to understand a dissension between the ksos hachoshen and the thivos mishpat. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that impinges upon the essence of why I am what I am, my worldview. And that's not being addressed. Would that there could be a meaningful intellectual discourse with the same tenor of rigor as pertains to the machlokas ksos and tzivos, but there isn't, because the mentors who ought to have been guiding that discourse are as ignorant of as their students are, if not more so.
Wow.
Well,
Would you consider it to be like the cause of this being fear? Maybe that kind of there's this idea, I don't agree with it necessarily, but there's this idea that getting too into the quote unquote rationalism of the Rishonim will lead people, like especially starting the Rambam, will lead people to enlightenment, secularism and so forth. Whereas the response has been the last few hundred years since is Kabbalah is the response. And then you have with like the Reform and conservative and versus the Orthodox, you have the Orthodox moving away from, let's say, Tanakh study, learning our history, and going towards just Talmudic study. So do you find that these are based in kind of a willful ignorance?
I'm not going to come to offer explanations for the sort of ignorance. I identify the phenomenon of ignorance. What I will also note is it possible to misread Rambam on a level that will fan the flames of such a facile understanding? Of course it is. And that's precisely the problem, because where can you find, ostensibly, the serious study of Rambam today? It's in the academy, it's not in the yeshiva. This is a phenomenon that isn't new. Rav Kook derided it 100 years ago. But that's precisely the challenge, to recognize that the Rishonim, the giants of Jewish philosophy, weren't interested in abstract philosophy. They were interested in Avodat Hashem, how we come to serve God. And the philosophy was the means through which to be able to come to that Avodat Hashem. It is perhaps the greatest tragedy and simultaneously the most pernicious negation of what they represented, that for the most part nowadays, the study of those classics takes place in a sterile academic environment in which Avodat Hashem isn't at all on the table. Unfortunately, academic is an adjective with two meanings. And those two meanings in practice are inseparable, pertaining to the academy and being completely divorced from the realities of life. And it is a problem that can only be redressed through placing the study of these classics in the context of Avodat Hashem, in precisely that environment that should be completely oriented to cultivation of Avodat Hashem. Now, with respect to Kabbalah, I really don't regard myself as an appropriate address. It's something that is undoubtedly better discussed with others than with me. I will distinguish between the Kabbalah of the Rishonim and the Kabbalah of the Acharonim. I think that that bifurcation is an inescapable one. But simultaneously, what I will stress is that, as far as I can tell, from the extent to which I have engaged in that study, Kabbalah is not intended to be a substitute for theology. It's a form of avodah. If you take the premises of Kabbalah and understand them as theological principles, that is liable to lead to heresy. Because it's simply appropriating something in the wrong context and misunderstanding what it's coming to teach. So that arena that is oriented with respect to Avodat Hashem, okay, fine. So there can be different courses that can legitimately be in the same field of inquiry on the subject of Avodat Hashem. And a shir that I gave on Shabbat yesterday, I had occasion, in response to one of the questions that was raised by someone in the audience, to invoke a slim volume that is not just packed with meaning, but the very agenda of this slim volume, which, much to my chagrin, I think is almost unknown, is one from which we can all learn so very much. Sefer HaZikaron of the Ritva. The Ritva, one of the foremost disciples of the Rashba, who was one of the foremost disciples of Ramban, is coming squarely from the Beit Midrash of Ramban, and thus very much from the context of Kabbalat Rishonim, because after all, Ramban is one of the most important expositors of Kabbalah among the Rishonim, among the medieval sages of Spain. And the Ritva wrote this volume with one single agenda, and that is to defend Rambam in Guide of the Perplexed from the attacks of Ramban in his commentary on the Torah. And the Ritva himself writes that you could say that I'm replacing the Hebrew idiom with English idiom, sticking my neck out over something that I don't even agree with, because I'm coming from the Kabbalah of Ramban. But it's important for us to appreciate, says the Ritva, that Rambam has a cogent alternative view to that of the Mekubalim, and we have to respect them both. And parenthetically, the Ritva regards Rambam's not basing himself upon Kabbalah as resulting from either his not having heard Kabbalah or his having heard it and rejected it. And he regards both of those possibilities as cogent and acceptable. You don't have to be Mekubal. You can be a philosopher. That's legitimate, as long as you subordinate it to Avodat Hashem. And ultimately, while I am not in any way coming to oppose the study of Kabbalah, certainly Kabbalat HaRishonim, unfortunately nowadays it seems to me that Ramban is well enough ensconced in that zone of ignorance of contemporary students that his Kabbalah is all but unknown as well.
Right.
But if we're engaging in Avodat Hashem, on the contrary, we need to appreciate that there are different strokes for different folks. And for the rigorous thinkers, I don't believe Kabbalah will be able to provide the answers, in particular because, again, it is not providing you with a theological system, the understanding of emunot v'dayot that the luminaries of medieval Spain provided in their works.
You know, from my own personal experience, and I'm sure you feel the same way, when you go from like, fourth grade to fifth grade, your understanding of God and is based on Tanakh and on a very childish level, obviously. And then all of a sudden you're study Mishnah and Gemara, and there's really no discussion. It's not, I wouldn't consider it a quote unquote spiritual book or books. And the feeling you get is almost like, what are we doing? Who are we serving? Why are we serving him? It's that whole process of education, it feels like it's just missing. So what you're saying really resonates a lot. And I will say, part of the reason why I started this podcast is, as a proud Sephardi, we wanted to get people interested in learning Rambam and the Rishonim. And actually, we just started a series recently called Getting to Know the Rishonim. We just did one episode on the Ralbag with Rabbi Matt Schneeweiss and Rabbi David Campbell. So for those who haven't heard that, please check it out. And I really, really appreciate what you had to say right now, because it was really just on point. So thank you for that.
If I could just note, with respect to that transference from fourth grade to fifth grade, to express it, if I may, in contemporary terms of developmental psychology, Jean Piaget would have described that in terms of the transference from the concrete operation stage to the formal operation stage. In other words, cultivating the ability to abstract, which, of course, finds its expression explicitly in the Mishnah, the end of the 5th chapter of Avot, Ben Chamesh Lamikra, Ben Eser Mishnah. That is, in order to be able to deal with the abstract concepts of Mishnah, you need a level of maturation, 10 years, roughly, the beginning of the formal operation stage, that goes beyond the concrete thinking of the 5-year-old, which is adequate for understanding Mikra. And from my perspective, that's precisely the issue. In other words, the moment that one reaches that capacity to abstract, the questions become a completely different order of magnitude. And inevitably, the need for compelling answers becomes that much greater. Unfortunately, it pains me to say how many of our brethren go through life with a nursery school theology. That's a tragedy.
Very big problem.
And it's not going to cut it. That is, if I may invoke Rav Kook again in this regard, Rav Kook regarded the hallmark of the contemporary era as one in which facile platitudes of faith are inadequate even for Benoniim, even for people at a mediocre level of aptitude. And he regarded that as a blessing because it forces us to enunciate our beliefs on a more compelling plane. And if I may just add here a personal comment from another arena of my own life, I can personally testify the extent to which the global marketplace of ideas, there is such a profound hunger and thirst for what Torah Judaism has to say, not only among Jews. And all too often, that summons goes unanswered because we aren't enunciating what the Torah has to say. What a tragedy. And we just, a week ago, read Parashat Vayikra, and there is a midrash at the end of Parashat Vayikra Rabbah. Without going into all of the nuances of the midrash, I'll just cut to the quick. The bottom line of this passage in the midrash is, Im lo tagidu elokuti le'umot ha'olam harei ani porea mikem. If you don't make known my divinity to the nations of the world, I will exact retribution from you. If we're not doing our job, and I suspect in the saddest of terms we are not, then that's a summons and an indictment.
And I actually think you brought up Rav Kook. I'm paraphrasing, but I believe he says atheism cleanses the dross, the dross of petty religion, where I feel like, in a way, the modern age today is forcing us to re-examine how we, approach Judaism, because it has become very, superficial in many ways, and people just have this kind of simple faith attitude, and we're not going to dig any deeper. So I feel like these challenges, in a way, are God's way of telling us, we need to start reassessing things.
Inevitably, what comes to mind in this regard is, and I think this definitely pertains very directly to the subject of this discussion. When one considers the world of the shtetl that has been so idealized in the various fictional historical accounts that purport to tell us what the shtetl was like, it should, after all, be self-evident to us that if the shtetl was indeed the sort of idyllic world that it is purported to have been, then people's faith would not have collapsed like a house of cards the moment they left the shtetl. And what seems to me perhaps the most apt analogy to life in the shtetl, if I may invoke an analogy from very far afield, is the tragedy of burning down the rainforests. That is, when sections of the rainforest in the Amazon are destroyed, the real tragedy isn't the destruction itself, it's that the rainforest cannot regenerate. It can't regenerate because since there's almost constant rain, the nutrients are constantly being flushed out of the soil. And as a result, the environment is actually very nutrient poor. What preserves the rainforest is a whole web of interconnected interdependencies that keeps everything going as long as there's no disturbance. To the moment there's a disturbance, everything collapses. And again, everything collapses to an extent that it's almost impossible to regenerate. Likewise, the shtetl. The shtetl lasted for centuries. There could have been instances in which it was on the brink of collapse, even in its undisturbed state. But it still kept on going. It kept on going, if I may invoke a very popular refrain from Fiddler on the Roof, because of tradition. But tradition can only take you so far, especially when the level of scholarship is, to invoke another line from Fiddler on the Roof, at 3 I started Hebrew school, at 10 I learned a trade. Yiddishkeit is exactly as much as a child is able to absorb from age 3 to age 10, period. So tradition works as long as tradition works, but if there isn't going to be a deep, satisfactory, scholastic understanding, it's not going to last. And that's exactly where we are today. There are still strata in our community that I think are hoping for tradition to keep things going. And it is as such that when all is said and done, the paradigm of the yeshiva has really not changed very much in the last 200 years. But we're hemorrhaging. It's the deep, dark secret that everyone knows, but no one likes to talk about. We're hemorrhaging because we have a problem that we're not addressing. I pray that we should finally realize that we need to address it. That's also part of human responsibility. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving us a job to do.
Beautifully said.
Very nice. Can I just add a few?
Yeah, sure.
Just like sort of to add on to the points that were made. And I very much feel with Benji that, and like you said, we sort of stuck with this very primitive theology, like very immature theology in some sense. I remember once this really stuck with me. I was learning philosophy in the shul with the sort of chavrusa and sort of connecting it to the parsha. And there was a Rav there who said, it's usher to learn philosophy unless you've learned Tanakh. And I sort of found that so oxymoronic because this is a Rav who doesn't teach Tanakh in high school, it's just Talmud. So the problem is really there's sort of in the culture I grew up in, there's sort of a disdain for philosophy in general. And if the mentality is that you need Tanakh to learn philosophy, but sort of blocking out Tanakh in order to block out philosophy too is something that stuck with me. That's for sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, it provides a hermetically sealed box from which there's no escape. I can recall a number of years ago, I was being interviewed on a live radio program, and I invoked the Rishonim, and one of the callers called in and said, "You're not allowed to read the Rishonim, except through the prism of the current Torah luminaries." And it struck me as a way of guaranteeing that there will never be any escape from this mindlessness. But I pray that there needs to be a shift, and the shift will come. I just concomitantly pray that it should happen in a manner that doesn't simply lead to a horrific falling away on a level that, unfortunately, the current paradigm of yeshiva education is liable to engender.
I totally, no, that was very well put. And like you said, there's a thirst for the sort of Judaism, the sort of Jewish answers in the modern era that we have in order to share, but sort of is not being spread enough. I think with the new atheist movement, I was very drawn to all these debates with the new atheists and their opponents, but it sort of struck me that the new atheists, as much as they sort of try to dig into the Judaism I believe, or the religion that I believed in, it never stuck with me because the Jewish answer to these problems is vastly different than other religions' answers in some sense. And it's like there is a very powerful Jewish theological background, which is so important to spread nowadays. And so just to add on to what you said there.
What I can just add further to what you just noted is it's of course very difficult to characterize what that difference is, but if I need to invoke one word to characterize it, it is a realism. Judaism was never transcendentalist. It was always focused on living in this world. For Rabbi Yehuda Levi, any spirituality that is otherworldly spirituality is always suspect of being counterfeit spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
For both Rabbi Yehuda Levi and Rambam, it is axiomatic that the Torah will never demand of you to believe in something that contravenes your sense of logic, because doing so, whether it is impossible for logic to be contravened or not, doing so will necessarily be unreal to you. And the Torah doesn't want you to believe in something that will be perpetually at loggerheads with your sense of what's real. So that realism in itself engenders that experiential conviction. I know because I experience, and the experience is real to me. And there's something that is very healthy, even cathartic, in being able to have that sense of a healthy experience. But you need to engender that. You need to sensitize a person to it. And above all else, you need to prepare the vessels in order to be able to connect with it. And we aren't doing that. If anything, I suspect that nowadays there's much more of a tendency toward a sort of transcendentalism that eviscerates this very power of Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Beautifully said.
That's really beautiful.
So do you have time for one more question?
Please, by all means.
Okay. So considering Maimonides' emphasis on God's absolute unity and transcendence, how might the interconnectedness and interdeterminacy found in quantum mechanics, such as the observer effect, reflect or challenge traditional Jewish understanding of divine providence and God's interaction with the world? In the context of Maimonides' philosophical framework, where the laws of nature are seen as expressions of God's will, how might we understand the interdeterminacy and non-locality of quantum mechanics? Is it possible that these quantum phenomena reveal a more intimate involvement of the divine in the fabric of reality beyond the fixed laws, traditionally attributed to God's creation?
I have to admit that I'm going to take a rather circumspect approach to this. In that, while I myself, by training, am a scientist, and I feel a very robust resonance with study of science, it still is important for us to bear in mind, apropos of what we noted earlier, the limitations of what science can or cannot state. I feel compelled to admit that I am rather circumspect altogether with the attempt to wed theological assertions to any particular scientific system. That is, I do want to get back to quantum mechanics. But before I do, I feel very much beholden to, first of all, David Hume in An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, the skeptical doubts concerning the operations of understanding, both part 1 and part 2, and his skeptical solution of these doubts that immediately follow thereafter, part 1 and part 2, in appreciating the extent to which altogether that which we experience on some plane is the experience itself, and the attempt to impose upon it some causal understanding is always going to be presumptive, but never definitive. Essentially, the problem of induction that we already noted at the outset with respect to a limited corpus of data. And even more so than Hume, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I realize is a work that has been appropriated far beyond what Kuhn had in mind. He wasn't saying that science is merely some kind of free-for-all that doesn't get anywhere, but simultaneously the realization that science progresses through a series of paradigms, and none can be taken to be definitive or final as long as there's any empirical data at all that doesn't jive with the currently accepted paradigm, and that's pretty much always the case in any science that continues to be a subject of research. So for me to invoke science in the sense of a particular system in understanding the theology of Rambam is something that I will eschew. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that Rambam would eschew it as well. That is, when we consider what Rambam is doing in the Laws of Fundamentals of Torah, chapters 3 and 4, where Rambam is explicitly invoking Aristotelian physics, and doing so in order to provide the tangible expression of the imperative that he enunciates in chapter 2, halakha 2. How do you get to love of God and reverence of God? By contemplating nature. I humbly submit that not only would I not think to fulfill that imperative by studying Aristotelian physics, but that if Rambam were alive today, he would completely agree that we shouldn't be studying Aristotelian physics. I often wonder what Rambam would have to say about people who obsess on his medical statements after medicine has had the opportunity to develop another 800 years since he made those statements.
We actually just recently did a podcast with Dr. Len Goodman on this exact topic, like what would Rambam say today? I could send you that separately. I think it's you'd really enjoy it. But
there are certain things that Rambam stated that are that were really prescient and have relevance conceivably for generations to come. But there's an awful lot that's based upon Galenic medicine and the presumptions of Aristotle that are completely obsolete. And Rambam didn't study the science of some other time. He studied the science of his time. Granted, the science of his time was on many levels merely a carryover of the science that had developed over a millennium earlier, but that wasn't because Rambam was bent upon some kind of reactionary science, as course that was the way science developed in those days. We've graduated beyond that. So, in fine, with respect to the imperative of studying science, to me, more than anything else, the imperative that we learn from Rambam is that God orders the universe. And it is specifically by studying that order that we're able to cohere, as it were, with God and what he has revealed to us. It is, of course, in this vein that we appreciate very deeply why, for Rambam, this is an idea that he enunciates in his introduction to Avot in the Shmona Prakim, and further in his commentary on the 5th chapter of Avot, and at greatest length in the guide, Unit 2, Chapter 29, where Rambam emphasizes that, from his perspective, both that which we describe as the miracle and that which we describe as nature are reflections of the same system that God creates. Now, understanding what Rambam is stating there is not a trivial enterprise, and I don't know to what extent we really have the time to go into it at greater length. There's a very impassioned, would almost say diatribe, against what Rambam states there in Abravanel's commentary on Avot, chapter 5, on that which was created in the twilight zone of creation, and Nachalat Avot, where he's against Rambam and he's also against Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And I think there's a fundamental lacuna in Abravanel's understanding of what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and Rambam are both stating. But for our purposes at present, the enterprise that both of them enunciate with respect to that which we describe as the miracle on some plane embedded in a divinely ordained system is so compelling because, certainly in the case of Rambam, but to some degree also for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, it is an imperative for us to strive to come to God through exercise of our intellect. When we encounter the enigmatic miracle, the best we can do is stare at it agape with our jaws having dropped and our intellects being quiescent. Rambam isn't interested in our intellects being quiescent. He's interested in our harnessing our intellects as means through which to come to the source of everything that takes place in the system, in God. And to that extent, even regarding the miracle as somehow embedded in nature on a level that we don't understand, is completely germane from his perspective, again, in keeping that intellect constantly active. You know, I always like to use a mathematical analogy here, that if the graph has a sharp corner to it, then the function is behaving in a discontinuous manner. There's no way of defining the derivative. You don't know what's taking place. And in some plane, again, in terms of your bringing to bear your analytical capabilities, you're forced to be quiescent. Rambam doesn't want you to be quiescent. He wants to be using your mind constantly. You know, where does Rambam first introduce the centrality of the mind in the guide? First chapter, where it tells you that the essence of God imprinted upon man is the intellect. That's Tselem and Dmut. Where does he enunciate that point the last time in the guide? The last chapter, where he gives you the 4 levels of completeness and tells you the 4th and highest level of completeness is intellectual completeness, through which a human being is a human being. That's precisely the summons. So the study of science is critical. It's critical in order to be able to see God as author of a system. But so far as the specific nuances, Rambam, I submit, is somewhat skeptical with respect to that. There are a number of places in the guide where I could invoke evidence for that. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is decidedly so in describing nature, the study of nature, in the first treatise of Sefer Kuzari in section 77 as Shoresh ha'emunah v'shoresh ha'meri, the root of faith and the root of rebelliousness, because you can take it any which way you want. So what I am going to invoke from science is, as a believer, something that will enhance my connection with God as the author of all that is. But I'm not going to attempt to establish a theological system through being wedded to a particular paradigm of physics or any other branch of the sciences. Now, with respect to quantum mechanics, what I do feel compelled to emphasize, again, hedging, that there are certainly enough problems in the current paradigm of quantum mechanics to expect that it will be at some point superseded by another paradigm that will supplant the currently accepted one. But it does give us a sense of the extent to which, indeed, in this world, in our perception of reality, there is that irreducible subjectivity. That is the centrality of the observer in quantum mechanics, as even to the extent that the parameters of physical reality may be undefined, not merely unknown, in the absence of an active observation. If you ask me, does that have philosophical implications in my worldview? My response is, of course, not because I regard that as necessarily a final word, and also not because I am going to become some kind of inveterate solipsist who doesn't believe that there is any well-defined reality out there. But again, because, as we already noted, we do believe that there is an objective reality out there, but we also are circumspect in appreciating our own limitations in the extent to which we can know it on any plane beyond our own subjectivity in here. And to that extent, again, that's something that I can certainly borrow, at the very least, at the level of an analogy from quantum mechanics without being wedded to the particular paradigm. But it's not going to affect my conviction that, on the one hand, God is indeed the author of the system that I observe in the world. And as author, he's also sovereign over that system. And simultaneously, that through the order of that system, I am able to trace my way to the orderer. Not a proof, but a direction.
Wow.
That was amazing. Thank you. Wow. Really was an honor to have you on, and my brain has just got a great workout, so I appreciate that. And if you have anything to plug quickly, please go ahead. And definitely your channel. We mentioned.
Yeah, at this point, I'm just going. Well, I invite everyone to our YouTube channel, Jewish Philosophy Matters. It's still very much of a work in progress. There's sadly not a whole lot of content on it yet, but it is a platform that we do hope to be cultivating further, and certainly to connect through that, so we have some kind of a sense of where things should continue to develop. Because I think we have the same agenda. We need to enhance the extent to which our Avodat Hashem is something that can indeed be not only rigorous, but compelling to the generations that lie ahead and to us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was amazing. And we hope to do this again.
B'simcha.